violence become synonymous with crime. And in 2013, the problem drew national attention when an act of violence claimed the life of a promising young student. The Chicago area was settled in 1779 as a trading post. Its name comes from the Miami Indian word for the wild leeks that grew along the banks of Lake Michigan.
The first settler here in Chicago was John Baptiste Point du Sable, who was a fur trader. He was from Haiti, clearly had a lot of knowledge on where to build and thrive in his trade, and was able to settle here and really make a mark in building Chicago into what it is today. We ended up becoming a hub for shipping. Chicago was definitely a hub for immigrants and for those African Americans looking to become entrepreneurs.
Chicago was a promised land, if you will, for African Americans who lived in the South and were seeking to flee both economic violence and actual physical violence and being racially terrorized in the South.
By the early 1900s, Black communities accounted for over 40,000 of the city's residents.
You see that they're all working together to build these different businesses so that it essentially created a family within the community. Not only on the South Side were you seeing Black churches, entertainment venues, restaurants, but Black people got a chance to become journalists through the Chicago Defender.
The Chicago Defender was an African-American newspaper that was rooted in the Black community. They wrote about Chicago, but they also wrote about Black people all over the country.
World War I caused a ban on European immigration, leading to labor shortages. But some Chicago journalists saw it as an opportunity for the city.
They began a campaign through the Chicago Defender calling for African Americans to flee the South and settle in major cities in the North, including Chicago. Black people responded. They responded by boarding the trains and riding the train lines from the South to Chicago.
It would come to be known as the Great Migration. Between 1910 and 1970, 8 million Black citizens left former slave states looking for a better life. More than 500,000 of them ended up in Chicago.
They brought the cuisine, they brought the sounds, the music, the way of speaking from the South to Chicago and settled on the South Side and settled on the West Side.
Chicago's the home of the blues, and a lot of that happened in Bronzeville. You walk all up and down Bronzeville, bar hopping, great food, soul food, everything in Brown Little City.
The Civil Rights Movement helped lift Chicago's restrictive housing laws, but the city would remain largely segregated.
As a result of housing covenants, of redlining, of bank discrimination, landlord discrimination, Chicago ended up as a segregated city. It was an engineered segregation that meant that African Americans ended up living all together on the South Side and West Side of Chicago.
By the 1970s, the once booming industrial sector was drying up, and Chicago's Black communities were the hardest hit.
With that, we saw a downturn like no other, because now it involves Black Americans trying to, fight or flight situation where they're trying to provide again for their family, trying to put food on the table.
When it comes to years and decades of systematic racism and oppression and the way that the breakdown happens, it's not a coincidence that there are so many abandoned houses and open lots and liquor stores all in one area.
The 1970s also brought a new problem: drugs and gangs.
There was a void of Black leadership because a lot of our Black leaders were either assassinated or imprisoned. Malcolm X was killed, Dr. King, the Black Panther Party for self-defense were dismantled. So that pretty much left a void in the community, and some of the guys decided that they wanted to form street gangs. Heroin was dumped in our community, the dope trade. So a lot of the gangs, they never organized to sell the dope in the beginning. They were organizing to take over territories. I heard stories of guys riding around with $1 million in the trunk of their cars, duffel bags full of money. Chicago definitely experienced an epidemic of crack cocaine. The dope game was so lucrative from the 80s all the way to the year 2000.
The money and drugs also brought a rise in violent crime.
Just like the mafia did back in the day in New York, they had the crews that would hang out together, and the violence began to get a little bit more out of control because the drug trade compounded with guys trying to carve out territory was a recipe for disaster.
Today, those gangs are being led by a new generation.
What we've seen is these little factions now that have emerged. Before, you might have the Gangster Disciples or the Latin Kings, right? And you had that structure. Now you have all these little factions that fight amongst each other, okay?
These kids, they don't have no leaders. They don't have nobody to look up to. So they're just out here every man for themselves. And it's all about money. It's all about drugs. Who's running this block?
The danger element has increased. The violence has increased. It's just kind of like the Wild West.
By the mid-2000s, Chicago was being used politically as a prime example of inner-city violence. And one high-profile crime would once again put the city in the national spotlight. Tuesday, January 29, 2013. 9 days after President Barack Obama's second inauguration, Chicago police receive a flurry of 911 calls about a shooting in Kenwood.
There was just something shots fired in the park next door. Yeah, just sir, shots fired. 44th and Oakenwall.
Kenwood is a neighborhood with new houses, large, stately, handsome estates, and a very rich history of ambitious and accomplished African Americans who live there. This all happened less than a mile from where the Obamas lived.
The Kenwood area is not really an area that you would associate with a lot of gun violence.
Police and paramedics arrived to a chaotic scene with multiple young victims.
One was shot in the ankle. The other one had a graze wound to his foot. You've got one victim who actually runs and collapses as she's running.
That victim is 15-year-old high school student Hydea Pendleton.
Hydea was born and raised on the South Side. Hydea's father is an entrepreneur. He's a business owner. He's a chef. He's well known. Her mother is just well known because of her personality and just having reach in the community.
Hydea's mother was an activist in the community, and Hydea was following in her footsteps as a sophomore at Chicago's King College Prep School.
She was known as being outgoing. She was a presence. She was known to light up a room. And she was known as being destined for success.
She was a smart young lady, honor roll student, did extremely well in school, had a future, goals to go to college.
For most of her young life, Hydea managed to avoid the pitfalls that sidelined many of her peers.
A lot of times I've seen good kids kind of fall to the wayside and get involved in gang life. And you're talking about someone who didn't, someone who clearly had a great future.
Hydea was a very busy girl, and that was great because it kept her involved in so many extracurricular activities, volleyball, the dance team. Hydea did get the opportunity to perform in the Bud Billiken Parade because she was on the dance team.
The Bud Billiken Parade has been a staple here in Chicago for decades.
It was like a back-to-school parade, the biggest African-American parade, at least in the United States.
Bud Billiken was like a fictitious character that they named the parade after, but at the same time, it did help to instill Black pride. all over the place. And I'm talking about millions of people watch the Bud Billiken Parade on television every year.
Hadiya and her bandmates had even been invited to perform at their presidential inauguration. Now, just a week later, this young student is fighting for her life. Chicago police are on the scene of a playground shooting that has left 15-year-old Hadiya Pendleton in grave condition. While paramedics rush her to the hospital, detectives question witnesses to find out what happened.
They were in shock and didn't expect this, number one. Were literally just having fun amongst themselves when this happened. It was their finals week and they had just finished taking finals.
The students were let go out of school at an earlier time because they needed the extra time to prepare for the next day of exams.
Harsh Park is a quaint little park, an old-fashioned Chicago little park with a play lot where, on a good day, on a sunny day, you're going to see kids playing in that play lot and families there with their children.
They were playing in the park, doing what teenagers do, having fun, probably telling jokes, talking about the boys and all that stuff.
It began to rain, so Hadiya and her friends took shelter under a small canopy.
They pile up in this area, talking to each other, having what seemed like a good time, and then suddenly shots ring out.
What you have is chaotic. You've got high school kids running, fearing for their lives.
So imagine a lion, a full adult male lion running through that park that day and catching everybody off guard, trying to devour somebody, right? Just put that in your mind for a minute. And that's what happened.
You talk about a traumatic experience. It clearly is a traumatic experience for anybody. Here you are, just out in the park talking to your friends, and suddenly you're dodging bullets.
As she ran, Hadiya was shot in the back.
She didn't even realize at first that she was shot until she collapsed and made a comment about, "I think I've been shot."
What started out as a day of learning in school and being tested, just trying to hang out and spend time with each other, has turned into a complete tragedy.
Unfortunately, the teens are only able to give police a general description of the shooter.
It was a male black, younger in age, 18 to 20 years old. There was not an eyewitness who gave a name to the police, like, I know who did this. Many times with your civilian witnesses, in the middle of a very traumatic experience for them, you can't really expect them to be paying attention to every little detail when, in fact, they're being shot upon.
Police search for shell casings at the scene, but come up empty-handed.
That led investigators to believe the type of gun that may have been involved, which was possibly a revolver.
Meanwhile, Hadiya's parents are at the hospital bracing for news about her condition.
Paramedics did all that they could do, but by the time that she arrived to the hospital, she was unresponsive. By the time that Hadiya was shot and doctors pronounced her dead, only an hour went past. I feel for Hadiya's parents. You see your child doing everything right, going to school, getting a good education, on the volleyball team, active within the community. And then, like that, she's gone.
You have to put yourself in the mindset of preparing that loses his or her son or daughter to gun violence prematurely. And her mother, man, it's rough, man. It's just rough.
In the aftermath, police canvassed the neighborhood looking for more eyewitnesses. Luckily, a retired police officer had seen everything from his apartment nearby.
He was looking out of a window. He was upstairs. He kind of had an elevated view looking down.
He had noticed two young males milling about within the neighborhood, very suspiciously, though. It was enough for him to look out and be on alert.
The officer had also made a note of the type of car the two young men were driving.
He was able to identify two males, which You would think it was one, but luckily now we know that it was two. And also identify their vehicle, a white Nissan. That was key.
One of the offenders gets out of the car and just starts riddling that play lot and shooting at that group of kids. He saw the shooter run back to that car that was waiting for him and the car take off.
The witness says both suspects were young black men and the shooter was wearing a blue sweatshirt.
The benefit of having someone like that who has a background in law enforcement is that they are paying attention to as much detail as they can. They know the make of the car, the color of the car, the fact that two people, one was a driver, the shooter was in the passenger seat.
To investigators familiar with the area, it sounds like a gang shooting. But why would they target children?
Unfortunately, what we've seen in so many great neighborhoods here in Chicago is the infiltration of gangs and areas that were always considered safe. And I think what we've seen, that particular park was known to be the territory of one particular gang.
Police issue an alert for the white Nissan. Meanwhile, news of the shooting spreads quickly, all the way to Washington, D.C.
The national attention was endless. I mean, it was on the highest level possible, especially when it makes it to the president.
For residents of Chicago's South Side, violent crime is an unfortunate fact of life. In 2013, the shooting of 15-year-old Hydea Pendleton was already the 42nd homicide in January alone. And Chicago police were facing an all-too-common question. Were these kids targeted because of any gang affiliations?
None of those kids that our victim was with were gang members. None of them were involved in any kind of violence. They were simply high school kids hanging out after school.
It really captivated and kind of shook up the entire city. Hydea was doing everything that she was supposed to do. She was earning good grades. She was volunteering after school. She was a good friend. She wasn't affiliated with a gang-related boyfriend. She didn't have friends who were in the prison system. There was no bad word about Hydea. She was doing all the right things.
The day after the shooting, the Chicago police superintendent holds a news conference with Hydea's parents.
The city was doing all that they can to try to, solve this case. They put out a reward in the sum of $40,000.
This particular case, I think, struck a chord with so many people because our victim was a beautiful young lady with a future, and people were appalled by what happened. As she had the honor of performing at the president's inauguration, and then a week later being, gunned down in her own neighborhood, near her own school, and really about a mile away from President Obama's home here in Chicago. The media highlighted her background.
She just had a beautiful spirit.
And that's, I believe, how this case really got the national attention that it did.
Within hours of the broadcast, the story becomes national news, in part because of Hydea's connection to the Obamas.
The murder of Hydea definitely resonated and reached the president and first lady. She had marched in the inauguration just weeks before she was killed. The State of the Union address, President Obama mentioned Hydea and talked about gun control and the need to address youth violence.
On Thursday, January 31st, Chicagoans take to the streets in the first of several marches to demand action.
For this young girl to be murdered, I think it got the attention, one, of a lot of young people who had either come in contact with Hydea, who were friends of a friend, or were just following the story of what took place and how amazing this young girl was. So I think that it opened a lot of eyes and sparked a lot of activism to take place. Even with her own family, who took steps forward to make sure that it didn't just stay as a tragedy.
On February 9th, hundreds of mourners gather in the Greater Harvest Baptist Church for Hydea's funeral.
But I attended the funeral myself. It was just so jam-packed. Hearse to the core, so everybody at that funeral was crying, everybody. I didn't see a dry eye anywhere.
Reporters were not even allowed inside because there was no place to sit, so they had to broadcast the audio and stream it so that people could hear it because so many people were tuned in.
Among the attendees are Chicago's Mayor Rahm Emanuel, Illinois Governor Pat Quinn, and First Lady Michelle Obama.
Everyone wanted to make sure that they paid respect to Hadiya and to Hadiya's family because she was the symbol of violence that shook everyone awake in this city.
The First Lady attended her funeral, which quite personally I think was tremendous.
The First Lady showed up out of respect for her family and Hadiya Pendleton. So it really pierced the heart of a nation, especially the Black community. And even white people and Hispanic people and Asian people should feel hard for Hadiya Pendleton because it could happen to one of your kids.
Meanwhile, the investigation into her death continues.
The Chicago Police Department was under great pressure to get this case solved and to get this case solved quickly.
$40,000 is a lot to someone that definitely doesn't have it. And although it was garnering some tips and garnering some people calling and saying information that they had, it ultimately wasn't enough.
Reality, law enforcement, they're up against, it's a tough battle to try to solve, homicides and catch the perpetrators because there's a code of silence that exists in the community. They're not talking because people scared to talk. If you tell on somebody in the neighborhood, you still live in the neighborhood, chances are you can lose your life.
Fortunately for police, that code of silence was about to break. In the weeks following Hadiya Pendleton's murder, the city of Chicago committed extensive resources towards solving the high-profile case.
They had different units of the police department handling the case. It wasn't just two investigators. It was a whole force. It was a whole team of people that were involved. Despite there being many people at the park that day, unfortunately, no one was able to identify the shooter. So the key element in them moving forward is tracking down who the white Nissan belonged to so that they can figure out who was the shooter.
Investigators look at footage from security cameras near the park, but unfortunately, none of them caught the Nissan on tape. A search of traffic stops in the area turns up a hit, however.
Investigators were able to actually find a white Nissan sedan that did get stopped. So that was a huge break in the case. If it was not them taking those extra steps and utilizing those extra resources, this could have been a needle in a haystack.
The driver was 18-year-old Michael Ward.
Now they have a name. They run the car and find out who it's registered to. They find out that it's registered to Michael Ward's mom.
Upon investigators getting this lucky break and able to find who this white Nissan belongs to, they learned Michael Ward is an established gang member.
At this point, the case is starting to come together for the law enforcement.
It's starting to look like Hadiya was caught in the crossfire between rival gangs. And police catch another break when a jailhouse informant gives him the name of Ward's accomplice, 20-year-old Kenneth Williams.
Kenneth Williams was from that area, and Kenneth Williams actually had attended the same high school as Hadiya. He was a member of a gang, and that he had been the victim of a shooting months earlier by an opposing gang.
Williams and Ward both have criminal records, but neither have committed murder before.
They had some previous history and previous run-ins with the law and not really doing any real time for any of the crimes that they were committing.
Kenneth shoplifted once and was arrested for that. Michael Ward was no saint. He had a juvenile past, and he also had a gun conviction. So that definitely put red flags up to investigators.
The first thing that came to mind at the time when I found out about their records is that, you know, hey, if these guys would have been locked up, this girl would still be alive.
3 of their fellow gang members agree to talk to investigators. According to them, Ward was the shooter.
An informant ended up saying that Ward was calling and talking about a crime that he committed where he just went and popped off in a park with a lot of kids. He was disgusted with his friend and ultimately came forward. Williams was braggadocious. He felt he had no remorse about what he did. He felt like we were going to do, quote unquote, a drill, which is just basically retaliating against another gang. But he didn't give a care about who was caught in the crossfire.
Security footage from a gas station confirms that Williams and Ward were in the Nissan leaving the scene of the crime. On February 9th, investigators arrest them both.
They were together on their way to a strip club when police apprehended them. We've all seen cases where it's taken months, even years, to solve a crime. So the fact that they were able to run down every lead and get information and to solve this within weeks is actually amazing. Everyone wanted this case to be solved. Everyone, not just her family and her parents, you know, but the community wanted it to be solved.
Williams refuses to talk, but they have better luck with Ward. After 23 hours of interrogation, he finally gives a statement.
Michael Ward had an alibi because he claims that he was nowhere near the park and that he actually went to go pick up his little brother from school. So it put him totally in a different area at the time of the shooting. There started to be a change in Ward's story once he realized he was caught up, because investigators told him, listen, we've talked to other gang members and we already know you were there, you admitted to it.
Eventually, little by little, he started to, as we would say, give up his involvement in the particular crime, in this particular shooting.
By the time Ward finishes telling police what happened, Haidia's death seems even more tragic.
Senseless. I take it as like stupidity, the entire incident.
But it was a mistaken identity. For me, hearing that, it's like, it's the same old, you know what I'm saying? It's like, here we go again.
3,000 teens are lost to gun violence every year in the United States. The media attention surrounding Haidia Pendleton's death made her a grim reminder.
There had been a long push for attention to the youth violence problem that was bubbling